Hello, welcome back to Talking Europe on France 24. You find us in Oslo, capital of Norway, where I'm pleased to be talking to the Foreign Minister, Ina Eriksen Søreide. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, your country has a population of just over 5 million people, but it covers a landmass bigger than Germany or the United Kingdom. Norway famously rejected membership of the European Union twice in referendums in 72 and 94, but it is a member of Schengen, the visa-free travel zone, and the European Economic Area, along with Iceland and Liechtenstein. So I'd really like to talk first about something that's been a big topic of conversation ever since June 2016, Norway's relationship with the EU. Of course, as the UK reconsiders its future partnership and relationship with the EU, we often hear talk about the Norway model. Can you fill us in on what the Norway model actually is, what the advantages are for Norway, how it works out?
Well, I think that for a country like Norway, with a very open economy and very based on exporting our goods, we find it very valuable to be part of the common market. And of course, that gives us, again, access to a home market of 500 million people. I mean, we're a country of 5 million people, so that says a lot. And 80% of our export goes to the EU. So what happens is that we are part of the single market with all the 4 freedoms, and we are very mindful of the fact that the single market should keep its integrity also after Brexit. And we also are part of the common rules system, which means that we have common standards, for instance. We have common rules in this regard, and that serves us very well. And of course, there are some disadvantages as well, as all agreements have. And we have covered our relations with the EU through the EEA agreement, which is the pillar, and now celebrating 25 years, but also around 70 other different agreements that we have with the EU.
In terms of what it could mean for the UK, of course, doesn't have Norway's vast oil and gas wealth. That really makes it a very fundamentally different situation from the get-go, doesn't it?
Well, I'm always very cautious about advising other countries on what they should do. And what we take note of is Britain's very firm stance on not wanting to become an EEA member, not wanting to become an EFTA member. And of course, our economies are very different, as you pointed out. At the same time, if the UK should change their stance and their position on this, of course, we will discuss that.
As we mentioned, the proposal from the UK government currently is not to be part of the single market or to allow free movement of people, as Norway does. So speaking as foreign minister of a country that would be very likely to want to strike its own trade deals with the UK post-Brexit, would that model make the UK a more or a less attractive proposition?
Well, again, I would not advise the UK at all on what they should do. But what we are looking for is, of course, to keep a very close relationship with the UK. We have always had that in areas such as trade, but also, of course, security policy. We have a lot of Norwegians living in the UK. We have a lot of Britons living here. And we'd like to keep it that way. And for our part, we're looking into also trying to mirror as much of the agreement between the UK and EU as possible. And that's also why we hold close contacts both with the UK and the EU nowadays.
You have previously said in the last couple of months that you believe Norway could strike a new deal with the UK on trade before the UK has actually finished the so-called transition period post-Brexit. Could that really be done without incurring sanctions from the EU that were laid out in a recent document?
No, I'm not talking about striking a deal, but I'm talking about starting the conversations. And my very clear understanding also from talking to the EU side is that, of course, preparations needs to be made. And what are challenging issues, of course, for us and also for Iceland and Liechtenstein is that we're not part of the negotiations, obviously, since we're not EU members. But that means that we also have to prepare for any possible outcome. So right now the government is preparing for a smooth and orderly Brexit, but we're also preparing for a scenario with a no deal. And of course that has very different implications for Norway as well. So we're preparing for everything, and our aim and our goal is both to keep the single market intact, but also to keep a very close and good relationship with the UK.
As time marches on and there's more and more talk of a no-deal scenario, do you see that as becoming a likelihood?
We are preparing for all scenarios. I still think the most likely outcome is an agreement and a deal, and that's also what we're hoping for. But of course, we have to take into consideration that, as you say, time is marching on, but also the fact that there are some difficult issues remaining. And I'm, of course, hopeful for the meetings that will take place now in October.
Now, looking at something that's been a topic all around Europe in the summer of 2018, they were very long, hot, dry months for Norway as much as for the rest of Europe. We've seen melting permafrost in the Arctic archipelago of Svalbard that's actually making people homeless by undermining the foundations of their houses. Is this a wake-up call for Norwegians about climate change?
I think it is a wake-up call for everyone, and I just came from Svalbard, and what we see, of course, in Svalbard is that climate change and warming is taking place twice as fast as anywhere else, which means that Svalbard is a very good barometer in a way for the state of climate globally.
Norway itself does seem to be in a rather paradoxical position on this because, of course, so much of the country's wealth comes from oil and gas exploration. There have been many new licenses handed out for oil drilling, a deal with the Russians over oil exploration in the Arctic. Clearly, there are economic arguments for all of these things, but environmental and climate risks as well. Some Europeans want a sanctuary in the Arctic. Norway not doing that so far. Why is Norway making these choices?
Well, I think it's important to be aware of the fact that Norway is an energy nation on many fronts. Oil, of course, is one, but also gas, wind, and hydropower. And we try to exploit all parts of our energy resources, both, of course, for ourselves, but also to do export. I think we have now around 40% of the gas export to the UK and amounts for 40% of their consumption. And of course, for us, it's very important that everything we do when it comes to energy has to have an environmental mark on it. So, which means that we use techniques, we have security issues that makes us more mindful of how we can do extractions that are environmentally safe and also sustainable.
Would you make certain areas of the Arctic no-go zones for drilling for oil, for example, as some environmental activists would like to see? That
has not been on the government's agenda now.
We're moving on to another issue that comes from Arctic ice melts, territorial disputes. There are claims in many of the frozen parts of the Arctic Sea that just simply aren't clear, lots of overlapping claims from different nations. How much of a concern is this to your government that as that ice melts, this becomes a real issue over who has jurisdiction there?
Well, actually, it's a lot less problematic than many people think, because we have a tendency to talk about the race to the Arctic and the race for resources. But the fact is that most of the resources and also most of the territory has already been settled. And that is also because the Arctic is a region that is characterized by being stable, being peaceful, and being very cooperative. So, for instance, in the Arctic Council, we are discussing many issues that are of joint interest, and we see that all countries in the Arctic abide by international law, and that is something that we strive to uphold because it is so important also in these issues. We struck a deal with the Russians about our maritime delimitation zone in 2010, which of course has been very important also in that regard. And what we see is a very peaceful and stable region that we are going to work to keep that way.
Well, I'd like to talk about relations with your biggest land neighbour and Arctic neighbour, Russia. There is deep suspicion of Russia from many of your Western and NATO allies currently, but in the region that borders Russia, there has been cooperation for many years. We have a report from our team, from Johan Baudin and from Isabelle Romero, who've been up to Kirkenes.
1,800 kilometres from Oslo, but just 3 hours' drive from Murmansk. Norway's Kirkenes is a crossroads between Russia and the West. Fishing in the Barents Sea was once a source of friction. That's no longer the case.
The management of the fish stocks, especially in the northern parts of our responsibility areas, is one of the most successful in the world, actually, because the fish stocks are very big. We manage these stocks together with the Russians, and we have a good cooperation with them.
Many local businesses see Russia as a useful partner. This electronics company benefits from lower costs in Murmansk.
Around 90% of our products are manufactured in Russia, and it's a really low cost level. There are a lot of possibilities in the Russian markets. They are developing very, very, very fast.
In Kirkenes, 1 in 10 residents is Russian. This is the northernmost frontier of the Schengen zone. Relations between the EU and Russia remain tense following the Ukraine conflict, but here the local motto is high north, low tension.
This was tested about 70 years. There is no positive effect of not talking to the neighbor. So having more dialogue, more cooperation, it is developing the local communities in both countries.
With hopes high for a viable northeast passage for commercial ships, Kirkenes sees itself as a strategic hub for the north. That, though, will rely on a continued thawing of relations with Russia.
Coming back to our interview with Ina Eriksen Søreide, Norway is currently part of the EU's sanctions regime against Russia that were imposed over the conflict in Ukraine. One local leader in the Finnmark region, however, recently said that these sanctions are detrimental to business there, to daily life. Is Norway committed to continuing these sanctions against Russia?
Yes, we are, and we have been aligning ourselves with the EU restrictive measures since the beginning. And that is because it is obvious for a country like Norway that we have to react when international law is breached and when a country annexes a part of another country. It is vital for us to stand together with our allies and neighbors in this regard. And of course, it's up to Russia to change their behavior, and by that also easing the regime when it comes to restrictive measures. Having said that, we have from Norway's side always had two pillars in our relationship with Russia. We have our NATO membership and our Western orientation on the one hand, and that is also very clear to Russia, and they know all about the consequences of our NATO membership. The other part is our quite expansive cooperation and extensive cooperation when it comes to everything from nuclear safety to environment to fisheries management, search and rescue, and a lot of people-to-people contact. And we cherish both of these pillars, and they are a vital and integral part of our foreign policy, but also our policy towards the neighbor of Russia.
I am interested in the defence picture. There's been the new long-term defence plan for Norway, which includes sending more soldiers and hardware into the Arctic. NATO beginning its biggest military exercises in the region called Trident Juncture. Now, there have also been Russian military manoeuvres in the Barents Sea, for example. Do you see a threat from Russia?
We don't see a military threat from Russia to Norway, and doing exercises with NATO is a very integral part of being a NATO member. We have to exercise and train, and we're doing that with the focal point of the middle of Norway this time, and I think it will be a very good exercise. And our new long-term plan, also of course of a defensive character, is mindful of the changes in security policy situation that we have seen in Europe. We have increased our defense spending, so has other countries in NATO, and that was necessary after many years where it was a decline in defense spending. But of course, we have also, in this regard, been very transparent, both of our defense planning, but also when it comes to the exercise, when we have invited also Russian observers to be part of the exercise and observe what happens.
On NATO, of course, there's been pressure from the United States, Donald Trump, essentially saying that many members aren't pulling their weight financially. Your country has recommitted itself to the goal of spending 2% of GDP on defence, but others still haven't fully committed to that, including France. Do you agree with Donald Trump that some NATO members are carrying an unfair burden, or do you think that he's gone too far?
Well, I think it's important to realize that this claim did not come with Donald Trump. This has been an American issue for the past 15 to 20 years from both Democrats and Republicans. And I think it's also important to underline that this is something that the NATO countries agreed on in 2014 in Wales. And it came as a result of a different security policy situation, but it also came as a result of declining NATO budgets for many, many years. So I think that the issue of burden sharing is absolutely a fair issue that many allies discuss, and that is also why Norway has, for the past 5 years, increased our defense spending by 24%. We're investing in new high-end capabilities for interoperability as well. And that development is going to continue, also adapting the alliance to a new security situation.
There's been much speculation about whether Donald Trump would pull the United States out of NATO. Do you believe that that's likely, possible?
No, I don't believe it's likely at all. On the contrary, we see an increased American engagement in Europe and in European security by new initiatives. We see increased spending by the US in Europe. And we also see a very, very firm commitment from Congress and from the political system in the US for NATO and for the engagement in NATO.
Just a question about something that's preoccupying much of Europe at the moment. There's a rising popularity of far-right parties, populist parties. Now, for many people, when they think of Norway, something that springs to mind is the murders by the far-right extremist Anders Behring Breivik in 2011 of 77 people. Does Norway have an issue with far-right, with extremists?
No, I wouldn't say that. This was a lone man's work, an extremist and a terrorist, and he is now serving his sentence, of course. I think that the Norwegian society has been coping quite well with the aftermath, but we still have to be vigilant about currents that could occur, and we have to be mindful of the debates that are taking place. And that is also why we want to have a very open and transparent political debate. We want to make sure that if we see some of these tendencies, they are also met by debate, they are met by discussions, and they are met by both politicians and civil society.
Within your government, there is the right-wing populist party, the Progress Party, which is the third biggest party from the most recent election. Do you see that there is a wave of more populist political thinking in Europe? Do you see that coming here to Norway, even though it's not a member of the European Union, which of course was so influenced by the migration influx, the lack of a quota system, that sort of thing?
Well, the Progress Party is, in my opinion, a very solid and good partner in government. They are a moderate party who also, of course, was created because they wanted to lower taxes, and that was their point of departure. I have concerns, however, of many of the trends that we see in Europe right now, and my point is that this is also a discussion of values, that we have to stand up in that debate and not letting certain countries or certain leaders in a way define an agenda that makes it okay with hate speech, that makes it okay to attack minorities, for instance.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Ina Eriksen, Søreide, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
You Are Here, your programme spotlighting French heritage.
Versailles, the Louvre, Mont Saint-Michel are well-known stars of French heritage. But French genius and France harbours many other hidden treasures. The arts, gastronomy, architecture, as well as nature's wonders. Come along with France 24, discover France's living heritage. From young apprentices to accomplished craftsmen and farmers, to Michelin star sporting chefs, meet these people whose passion for their professions preserve and drive French heritage.
You Are Here on France 24 and France24.com.